Welcome to The Deep Dive, the show that extracts the essential knowledge from the most complex documents. Today, the urgency of our topic, well, it could not be higher. We're undertaking a really crucial deep dive into Australian data governance, focusing squarely on breach management and accountability.
And we absolutely have to start by just establishing the sheer magnitude of the challenge facing Australian entities right now. I mean, if we look at the data reported by the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, the OAIC, from January to June 2024, they received 527 data breach notifications.
Wow, 527 incidents in just 6 months.
Yeah.
That figure is the highest reported since late 2020, and it just absolutely confirms that cybersecurity isn't some theoretical risk anymore, debated in boardrooms. It's a persistent, tangible threat impacting thousands of entities and, frankly, millions of individuals across the country.
The scale is just staggering.
Yeah.
We saw one single incident in that reporting period alone affect over 10 million Australians. Think about that. This scale, combined with the continuous stream of high-profile attacks, has fundamentally changed the regulatory landscape. It really reinforces the OAIC's clear shift toward a tougher enforcement-focused posture. They're setting significantly higher expectations now for data security and, crucially, timely response.
Exactly. The era of, let's say, lax compliance seems definitively over. You, our listener, have provided us with the definitive guides from the OAIC and the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, the ACSC. So our mission today is to give you the comprehensive shortcut. We're going to unpack the core requirements of the Australian Privacy Act, analyze the 4 mandatory steps for incident response, and detail the critical strategies for prevention. This is really your practical guide to being thoroughly informed on Australia's data governance playbook. And look, before we dive into the technical specifics, if you find this deep dive valuable, if it's providing you with the knowledge you need quickly and thoroughly, please just take a moment right now to like, share, and subscribe. And importantly, please leave us some feedback so we know exactly what topics and what depth of analysis are most helpful to you going forward.
Absolutely. And that new enforcement posture you just mentioned, that's the critical backdrop to this entire discussion. The OAIC is signaling, well, pretty loudly, that after 6 years of the notifiable data breaches scheme, the NDB scheme being operational, compliance is absolutely expected. Privacy has to be embedded into organizational practice. It just can't be an afterthought anymore.
So let's start right at the very beginning then. Let's establish the legal and practical boundaries. What exactly defines a data breach? And maybe more importantly, what are the specific consequences that elevate these incidents into actual crises?
Okay, so at its core, a data breach is defined as when personal information held by an entity is subject to unauthorized access, unauthorized disclosure, or loss. And that last point, the loss of information, is really crucial. I mean, even if the breach itself is just losing a device, if the information is lost in circumstances where unauthorized access or disclosure is likely to occur, well, that's a notifiable event.
Right. And entities really need to be precise about the data they actually hold. We distinguish between personal information and sensitive information because I guess that distinction immediately elevates the risk profile, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Correct. Personal information is basically any data that identifies or reasonably identifies an individual, names, addresses, dates of birth. But sensitive information, well, that's data that, if it's compromised, severely ratchets up the risk of harm. We're talking health records, biometric data, genetic information, political opinions, trade union membership, and what we see most commonly cited in breaches, financial details and government identifiers like tax file numbers and driver's licenses. The inclusion of that type of sensitive information just makes the possibility of serious harm exponentially higher.
And we really must talk about the consequences here. When data breach notifications land, the focus is often on the immediate financial cost to the entity, right? But the source material really forces us to recognize the severe impact on individuals.
Oh, absolutely. We're talking about identity theft, financial fraud, significant reputational damage. But the OAIC also specifically highlights deeper forms of harm, severe emotional distress, and even the risk of physical harm or intimidation. This risk is particularly acute in cases involving, say, personal details being exposed, which could link individuals to family violence or other dangerous situations.
That distinction, the risk of physical harm, that takes the stakes far beyond just a simple administrative failing, doesn't it?
Yeah.
When we talk about data protection, sometimes we forget the very real immediate danger that a data leak can cause for vulnerable individuals. That level of risk surely must inform every single security decision an organization makes.
It absolutely should. And the statistics, well, they show us precisely where the failure points are. From that January to June 2024 reporting period, malicious or criminal attacks were, perhaps unsurprisingly, the dominant source. They accounted for 67% of all breaches.
67%. Wow.
Human error followed next at a significant 30%, with system faults being pretty minimal at just 3%.
Okay, let's pull apart those cyber causes then. Of the malicious incidents, phishing, which, let's face it, is almost always a social engineering attack aimed at stealing credentials, that dominated at 31%.
Right. And then ransomware and incidents involving compromised or stolen credentials, where the actual method of theft might be unknown, they were tied next, both at 24%.
24% each.
And here's the crucial connection. Overall, just over half, 52% of all cyber incidents involved actors gaining access to accounts using those compromised or stolen credentials.
52%.
Yeah, that figure is pretty damning, isn't it? It tells us that security around login credentials, which is often the cheapest and easiest defense to actually fix, is the single greatest entry point for malicious actors in Australia right now.
Okay, shifting then to the 30% attributed to human error. The causes here are, well, sometimes shockingly preventable and often quite mundane, it seems. The number one cause was personal information, PI, sent to the wrong email recipient. That accounted for 38% of all human errors.
Yeah, followed by unauthorized disclosure, so an unintended release or publication at 24%. I mean, these are errors that, while they might be accidental, like forgetting to use BCC when emailing multiple people, they still carry the same legal weight under the NDB scheme if they end up resulting in serious harm. It's a powerful reminder that basic staff training is just as essential as, the most expensive firewall.
This brings us neatly to the legal framework underpinning all of this. The Australian Privacy Act of 1988, and specifically the Australian Privacy Principles, or APPs. This is the legal foundation for our deep dive today.
Right. The 13 APPs are really the backbone of data protection. They govern the entire data lifecycle: collection, storage, use, disclosure, and crucially, destruction. Compliance with these principles isn't just a legal requirement. It's actually an inherent mechanism for reducing breach risk.
And the principles that dictate security itself is APP 11. What's the core mandate of APP 11, and how does the OAIC interpret it?
Okay, so APP 11 is the security mandate. It requires entities to take reasonable steps to protect the personal information they hold from misuse, interference, loss, or unauthorized access or disclosure. And importantly, it's an active obligation, not a passive one. You have to be doing things.
That phrase, reasonable steps, it often causes confusion because it sounds, well, a bit subjective. How does the OAIC provide guidance on defining what's actually reasonable in practice?
It's principles-based, which means it adapts. It's not static. The OAIC is quite clear. Reasonable steps is determined contextually and objectively. It depends on basically four main factors: the entity's size and resources, the volume and sensitivity of the data they hold, the current state of technology, what security tools are standard now versus a few years ago, and critically, the possible adverse consequences for individuals if a breach actually occurs. Given the high-stakes consequences we just discussed, what might have been deemed reasonable even a year or two ago could now potentially be deemed negligent.
Which leads us directly to the mandatory reporting threshold under the NDB scheme. We know not every single breach is reported. What has to happen for a breach to be deemed an eligible data breach that must be reported?
Right, so 3 specific criteria must be met for mandatory notification. First, the incident has to involve data access, disclosure, or loss. Pretty straightforward. Second, an objective assessment must conclude that it is likely to result in serious harm to one or more individuals.
Okay, let's pause on likely there for a second. We need to be really precise about what the law means. Does that mean a high probability or just, any non-zero possibility?
It's actually quite a high bar. The assessment has to be objective, determined from the viewpoint of a reasonable person in the entity's position who is properly informed of all the circumstances. Likely to occur means the risk of serious harm is more probable than not. So if it's only, say, 49% likely, notification isn't mandatory. If it tips over to 51% likely, it is. This is where the entity's assessment team really needs to be rigorous and objective.
Got it. More probable than not. And the third, and often the most critical, criterion for the entity during that immediate aftermath.
The third one is this: remedial action has not prevented the likely risk of serious harm. This is the entity's window of opportunity, really.
Huh.
If they can act swiftly and successfully mitigate the risk of serious harm entirely, bring it back below that more probable than not threshold, they actually avoid the mandatory notification obligation.
Okay, so we've established that time is absolutely the enemy in a breach scenario. The sources are just crystal clear that a swift, coordinated response limits the financial costs, the reputational damage, and of course the individual suffering. And that coordination seems entirely dependent on robust preparation beforehand.
Oh, the necessity of preparation just cannot be overstated. An up-to-date, written data breach response plan isn't a luxury. It's the essential blueprint. The delay caused by trying to improvise a response in the middle of a crisis is often exactly what pushes an incident into that serious harm category, triggering notification.
So what elevates a response plan beyond just being a simple checklist on a shelf somewhere?
Well, a robust plan has to clearly define roles and responsibilities before the crisis hits. You need a dedicated response team leader, clear demarcation between, say, legal counsel, IT forensics, communications staff, and senior management. It must establish clear escalation criteria, for instance, maybe an automatic trigger when 1,000 records are involved, or if any health data is compromised. And crucially, the plan has to integrate with existing business continuity and disaster recovery plans. You need to ensure IT recovery doesn't accidentally destroy crucial forensic evidence, for example.
And I assume that preparation requires testing, right? You can't just write it and forget it.
Absolutely. Plans must be tested, ideally annually, via realistic simulations and tabletop exercises. You have to identify single points of failure, gaps in communication protocols, and actually measure the speed of your response. Knowing a plan exists on paper is, well, pretty meaningless. You have to prove it works under pressure.
Okay, so once a breach is suspected, the OAIC mandates a clear four-step response framework. Step 1 is immediate aggressive action. Containment.
Exactly. Containment is like the fire suppression phase. Immediate action must be taken to halt any further exposure. This could include things like revoking compromised access immediately, isolating or shutting down affected systems, trying to recover lost records if possible, and, very importantly, preserving all digital evidence. That means logs, images of compromised drives, everything needed for the later investigation. Remember, you absolutely must preserve the evidence that tells you how the breach happened in the first place.
Okay, then step 2 is assessment. This is where the clock is really ticking, and the entity has to determine the scope, the risk, and ultimately whether notification is mandatory.
That's right. The assessment must be conducted expeditiously. Now, for NDB entities, the maximum time limit for this entire assessment process from the moment of suspicion to reaching a conclusion is 30 days. However, the OAIC definitely expects entities to treat 30 days as an absolute outer limit and strive for a much, much shorter time frame. The risk of serious harm often just compounds with every single day of delay.
30 days still seems like a potential eternity when sensitive information is exposed. Does the OAIC often penalize entities that actually take the full 30 days?
They absolutely apply scrutiny. Look, if an entity takes, say, 29 days to finally realize a breach was eligible and then notifies, that delay itself could potentially be seen as an additional failing under the as soon as practicable requirement for notification, especially if that delay made the individual harm worse.
Right. So what are the key details that absolutely must be gathered during this assessment phase?
Rigorous fact gathering is mandatory. This means identifying the specific information type. Was it government ID scans? Sensitive health records, things like that. Determining the precise cause. Was it phishing? A system misconfiguration. Understanding the extent of the data copied or accessed. And conducting a comprehensive risk assessment of the potential harm, really considering those consequences we outlined back in Part 1.
And this assessment phase is also where the success or failure of remedial action really comes into play.
Precisely. Remedial action, those steps taken to reduce any potential harm, must be attempted. Think about remotely wiping data off a stolen laptop, or in the case of a misdirected email, legally obtaining confirmation from the unintended recipient that they have permanently deleted the file and don't have any copies. The legal impact here is immense. If remediation succeeds in objectively preventing the likelihood of serious harm, meaning the risk drops back below that more probable than not threshold, then notification is not required. That's the goal, if possible.
Okay, but if the assessment concludes the breach is eligible, then step 3 is notification. And this has to be done to both the OAIC and the affected individuals.
Correct. Notification must occur as soon as practicable, after the entity has reasonable grounds to believe an eligible breach has happened. Now, the entity has 3 basic options for notifying individuals, and they have to choose the most effective and practicable option in the circumstances. Option 1. Notify all individuals whose personal information was involved. Option 2. Notify only those individuals specifically at risk of serious harm, but only if that specific subset can be clearly identified. Or Option 3. Publish the statement publicly and publicize it widely, but only if direct notification to individuals is genuinely impracticable.
And the content of that notification statement can't just be generic waffle, can it? The OAIC demands specific, actionable information.
Yes, absolutely. The required content is strictly defined. It must include the entity's identity and contact details, a clear description of the breach itself, and critically, the specific kind of information involved. You have to actually say driver's license numbers and health records instead of just vague terms like ID documents. And most importantly, for the individual receiving it, the statement must provide practical recommended steps they can take, things like securing new credit reports, changing specific passwords, or perhaps enrolling in credit monitoring services offered by the entity.
Okay. And finally, we reach step 4. Review and improvement. This sounds like the long-term governance component, focusing on actually learning from the failure.
Yeah, true resilience is really built here. Post-incident analysis must ruthlessly focus on identifying the root causes. Was it poor patching? Was it inadequate training? A system misconfiguration? And then using that knowledge to update policies, boost staff training, and audit security controls to prevent it happening again. Debriefs should track successes and failures from the response plan test, ensuring the entity continually strengthens its security posture over time.
Right. Moving from the response to prevention then, we all know that avoiding the incident entirely is always going to be the cheapest and safest course. So let's look at the proactive strategies recommended by the ACSC and the OAIC, starting with the kind of cyber hygiene that tackles those top attack vectors we identified earlier, like phishing and compromised credentials.
Exactly. The ACSC guidance is really focused on creating a proactive security posture. Their recommendations, which align very closely with the principles of their Essential 8 mitigation model, emphasize foundational strategies that directly counter those main threats.
Now, for our knowledgeable listener, while we probably don't need to list all 8 strategies here, we should acknowledge that the Essential 8 really acts as Australia's benchmark for mitigation. So what are the key strategies drawn from that model that really must be prioritized by pretty much all entities?
Absolutely. And the top ones are directly related to the statistics we saw earlier. First, implementing multi-factor authentication, MFA, across all systems wherever possible. Second, keeping all operating systems, software, and applications patched and updated constantly, like really constantly. Third, using strong passphrases, moving away from easily guessable passwords towards longer, more complex phrases.
Okay, given that over half of cyber incidents involve compromised credentials, let's just focus on MFA for a moment. How can organizations implement MFA so that it's truly resilient against modern phishing attacks? Because we know attackers are getting smarter.
That's a great point. Entities really must strive for phishing-resistant MFA. That means moving beyond simple SMS codes or one-time codes that can still potentially be intercepted via sophisticated social engineering or man-in-the-middle attacks. Beyond MFA, the OAIC encourages layered security control, defense in depth to avoid single points of failure. Strict application of the least privilege principle is also vital, giving staff only the minimal access permissions they need to do their job, and deploying robust ongoing audit logs and access monitoring. Maintaining that chronological record of system activities is just vital for early detection of unusual internal or external access patterns.
Okay, so those are the technical controls. But beyond that, the OAIC also emphasizes data minimization, which seems like a really powerful risk reduction strategy built directly into the privacy principles themselves.
Data minimization is almost like the philosophical first line of defense. It's simple logic. Entities should only collect personal information that is absolutely necessary for their specific functions or activities, that's APP3. Furthermore, they must actively destroy or de-identify personal information that is no longer needed for any purpose that's covered in APPs 4.3 and 11.2. I mean, if you don't hold the data in the first place, it simply cannot be breached. Compliance with these destruction rules literally reduces the size of the target, lessening the potential scope and harm of any incident that might still occur.
Makes perfect sense. Finally, let's address the human factor. With human error accounting for a huge 30% of breaches and insider threats making up another 5% of malicious attacks, how do organizations mitigate the risk posed by their own people, whether accidental or deliberate?
Yeah, this risk demands continuous vigilance. We saw that misdirected emails account for 38% of human errors, which is huge. But entities are now dealing with rapidly evolving threats like QR code phishing, sometimes called quishing, where employees are tricked into scanning a malicious QR code, perhaps on their phone. This can bypass network-level security and sometimes even MFA controls if it directs them to a fake login page on their device.
Right, so how does an entity build resilience when the employee is, in many ways, the ultimate vulnerability?
Well, it requires a strategic approach built around both knowledge and control. First, staff training has to be highly prioritized. It needs to focus not just on basic security practices, but specifically on new, sophisticated threat techniques like quishing. And this training can't be a one-off. It needs to be ongoing and realistic, maybe using simulations. Second, enforce access minimization rigorously. Staff should only have access to the specific personal information required to carry out their immediate functions, nothing more. Third, proactively monitor systems internally. You need tools or processes that can flag suspicious activity, things like high-volume record searches, attempts to copy large datasets onto external drives, or unusual file uploads to external cloud services. Internal system monitoring is absolutely essential for catching potentially rogue employees or highly compromised accounts early on. Okay, so if we connect all this to the bigger picture, the OAIC isn't just writing guides and putting out stats anymore. They are now actively pursuing litigation to actually enforce compliance. The whole regulatory approach seems to have shifted quite significantly from primarily guidance towards real accountability.
And the definitive example of this new enforcement climate has to be the Medibank case, right?
Absolutely. The Information Commissioner filed civil penalty proceedings against Medibank Private Limited regarding its massive October 2022 cyber attack. The core of the allegation is that Medibank seriously interfered with the privacy of around 9.7 million Australians by allegedly failing to take reasonable steps under APP 11.1 to protect their personal information.
So what does that case tell us about what actually constitutes a failure to take reasonable steps for a large entity like Medibank?
Well, it strongly implies that for an entity of Medibank's size, with its resources and holding such highly sensitive health data, the expected standard of care is extraordinarily high. The OAIC is essentially scrutinizing whether the entity had genuinely robust, arguably state-of-the-art security controls in place at the time. A failure isn't just being breached. A failure is potentially not having security measures commensurate with the level of risk associated with the data you hold. This legal action really confirms that noncompliance is now a potentially very high-cost gamble, possibly resulting in millions of dollars in penalties.
And the NDB scheme itself makes a poor response, like failing to assess or notify properly, a serious matter in itself. It's an offense, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. Failure to conduct a reasonable assessment within that 30-day window, or failure to prepare and give a statement or notify individuals as soon as practicable once eligibility is confirmed, actually constitutes an interference with privacy under the Privacy Act. This gives the commissioner direct enforcement powers to seek civil penalty orders for serious or repeated interferences. So the process itself is under scrutiny, not just the initial breach.
Okay, moving to some external factors then. Supply chain compromise remains a profound risk. We saw this clearly in the recent Medisecure and out-of-box incidents, which impacted millions of people through third parties.
Yeah, supply chain and multi-party breaches are a chronic, ongoing issue. The fact that 34 notifications in just the first half of 2024 involve multiple entities really highlights this risk. Organizations absolutely must extend their security umbrella to cover their vendors. This means establishing strong supplier risk management frameworks, including really clear contractual clauses that define accountabilities for assessment and notification if something goes wrong at the vendor's end.
So if a vendor causes the breach, who's actually responsible for notifying the affected individuals? Does the buck stop with the vendor or the original company?
Well, the OAIC generally suggests that the entity with the most direct relationship with the affected individuals, which is often the primary contracting entity, the one the customer knows, should generally be the one to notify them. However, contracts really should establish a clear chain of responsibility for sharing information quickly and managing the public response cohesively. Clarity here is key.
We also have a clear warning in the source material about cloud security. Many entities perhaps assume that once data moves to a major cloud provider, security is fully handled by them. But the sources stress the danger of misconfiguration.
Yes, cloud misconfiguration is a highly significant and, frankly, often avoidable risk. We have to understand the shared responsibility model in the cloud. The provider, like AWS or Azure, handles the security of the cloud, the underlying infrastructure, the data centers. But the entity itself, the customer, is responsible for security in the cloud. That means proper configuration, managing access control, and ensuring data storage settings like encryption and public versus private access settings are correct. The stark example provided is that public bucket scenario where a default private setting on cloud storage was inadvertently changed, maybe by an employee, exposing sensitive government ID scans. You just can't outsource negligence, you're still responsible for configuring it correctly.
What's really fascinating here is the OAIC's view on threat actor motivation, particularly when a ransom is involved. Can an entity actually treat a criminal's promise to destroy stolen data as a valid form of remedial action to avoid notification?
That's a crucial point for any assessment team dealing with ransomware. And the OAIC is crystal clear on this. Entities absolutely cannot rely on a criminal's assurance, even if a ransom is paid, that they will destroy or not publish the stolen data and count that as sufficient remedial action to prevent the likelihood of serious harm. Why? Well, because a cyber criminal is inherently untrustworthy and fundamentally has a profit motive, not an ethical one. Therefore, paying a ransom is generally considered insufficient to negate the likelihood of serious harm, and the objective assessment will almost certainly still trigger mandatory notification. You can't trust the criminals.
They use a compelling case example as well to show how an entity's assessment of internal motive is often disregarded by the OAIC in favor of the objective risk to the individual.
Exactly. In this particular case, an entity discovered a rogue employee had accessed confidential customer data. The entity internally determined this access was not malicious in intent and decided against notifying the affected customers. However, the OAIC investigated and actually directed the entity to notify. Why? Because the rogue employee had a pre-existing personal relationship with the specific individuals whose data they accessed. That personal connection drastically heightened the objective risk of serious harm, like misuse or stalking, rendering the entity's subjective and perhaps self-serving assessment of the employee's motive completely irrelevant. The focus always is on the objective risk to the individual, not the intent of the perpetrator.
And finally, we really must look at government performance itself in this area. The Australian government sector is now, perhaps surprisingly, the second highest source for data breach notifications overall.
That's right. 63 breaches reported, which is 12% of the total in that period. It's its highest position ever recorded. This really highlights a critical internal challenge within government agencies. And a disproportionate number of these government breaches involved social engineering or impersonation. They accounted for 42% of all social engineering breaches across the entire country. This suggests actors are successfully bypassing identity verification procedures designed to protect sensitive citizen data held by government.
And apparently their response times are, well, pretty abysmal, according to the sources. The Australian government sector had the largest proportion of notifications where the agency only identified the incident more than 30 days after it actually occurred. That figure was 87%.
87% identify late.
And furthermore, 78% of their actual notifications were submitted to the OAIC more than 30 days after the agency became aware of the breach.
That level of delay, both in identifying and then in notifying, is frankly a major governance failure. Given that individuals often have absolutely no choice but to provide their most sensitive personal information to government agencies, these agencies really must model best practice and work hard to build community trust. These kinds of delays often stem from systemic failures, perhaps slow internal escalation processes, not getting incidents quickly to the appropriate response team, or maybe just a lack of internal readiness demonstrated by poor plan testing.
Okay, looking internationally just briefly, how does Australia stack up, particularly against the European Union's very comprehensive data regime, the GDPR?
Well, the comparison does reveal several key areas where GDPR currently sets a significantly higher bar, particularly when it comes to punitive measures and mandated individual rights. On penalties, for instance, GDPR fines can reach up to 4% of a company's annual global turnover, or 20 million, whichever is greater. You have to contrast that with the current maximum $4.2 million civil penalty in Australia for serious or repeated privacy interference. The Australian penalties are just significantly lower, which arguably might impact the level of deterrence for some organizations.
And the mandatory timeline for notification is dramatically different too, isn't it?
It really is. GDPR mandates notification to the regulator within a very tight 72 hours of the organization becoming aware of a breach. Australia's NDB scheme, as we discussed, only requires an assessment to be completed within 30 days and then notification as soon as practicable once eligibility is determined. That 30-day assessment window in Australia is often criticized, particularly internationally, as being potentially too slow in a world where data and harm can spread instantaneously.
What about individual rights? Does the Australian Privacy Act currently afford citizens the same level of control over their personal data as GDPR does?
Not entirely, no. GDPR provides a suite of comprehensive individual rights that currently lack direct equivalents in the General Australian Privacy Act, although some exist in specific frameworks like the consumer data right for certain sectors. Key GDPR rights include the fundamental right to be forgotten, or data erasure, the right to data portability, allowing individuals to receive and transmit their data to another service, and a clear mandate for privacy by design and by default, requiring entities to embed data protection measures, including minimization right from the onset of system development. These comprehensive rights represent a significant difference in philosophy and practical control between the two regimes at the moment. Hashtag tag outro.
So, we have navigated the three essential pillars of Australian data protection today: robust prevention through enhanced cyber hygiene and data minimization, systematic preparation using that tested four-step response plan, and of course, legally mandated notification via the NDB scheme. The underlying theme from all source material seems crystal clear: proactive compliance, specifically rigorous adherence to APP11's reasonable steps requirement, is demonstrably cheaper and exponentially safer than reactive damage control after the fact.
So what does this all really mean for you, our listener? Well, it means organizations simply must stop viewing privacy as merely a compliance checkbox to tick off. It really needs to be deeply embedded into every single process, every system configuration decision, and every staff training module. And this is especially true given the OAIC's new stricter enforcement focus, demonstrated so clearly in that Medibank action. The potential cost of failing to meet the reasonable steps standard is now, well, potentially enormous.
The source material also highlights this strong political push, or at least discussion, about rolling Australia's privacy laws and penalties closer to the comprehensive standards set by the GDPR. Now, considering the rather stark fact that the Australian government sector itself is now the second highest notifier of breaches and exhibits significant delays in its own response, this raises, I think, an important provocative question for us to consider as we wrap up. Will these evolving and escalating cyber threats ultimately force Australia to adopt GDPR-level penalties and individual rights to adequately protect citizens? Or perhaps will the government agencies themselves need to demonstrably fix their own profound security weaknesses first in order to establish the necessary public trust required for implementing stronger, more demanding regulation across the board?
That's a fascinating tension, isn't it? Between policy ambition on one hand and the current operational reality, particularly within the public sector itself.
Indeed. Thank you for engaging in this deep dive with us. We really encourage you to continue your own research using the definitive OAIC and ACSC resources mentioned throughout this discussion. They are invaluable.